She had looked at herself in the glass at the inn that morning and made a decision that felt, even then, like something she could not take back. Her hair was too well kept. That was the problem. She dampened it with water from the basin, dragged a comb through it carelessly, and pinned it back the way she had seen kitchen maids do it. Not elegantly, not with attention, just practically, the way a woman pinned her hair when no one was meant to notice her. She studied the result. Better. The dress was already right. Gray wool, plain collar, the kind of dress that rendered a woman invisible in a room full of people who had no reason to look at her. She needed to be invisible, at least for now. Her name was Isobel Crane, or rather, it had been Isobel Crane until her father died 18 months ago, at which point the solicitor in London had read aloud a document that made her feel as though the floor had dissolved beneath her feet. The estate, Thornfield Park, all of it, the house and the grounds and the tenant farms and the income from the wool trade, had passed into trusteeship under her father's brother, her Uncle Reginald. Until such time as the legal dispute regarding her mother's marriage settlement could be resolved. That was what the solicitor had said, a legal dispute. 18 months ago, the dispute had not been resolved. The solicitor had stopped returning her letters, and Uncle Reginald had, in the interim, died of a fever in March, leaving everything in the hands of his creditors, his executor, and a man Isobel had never met, who had apparently come to some arrangement that her father's solicitor either could not or would not explain to her satisfaction. That man was the Duke of Ashmore. He had taken up residence at Thornfield Park 6 weeks ago. Isobel knew this because she had stood on the road outside the south gate in the rain and watched the carriages arrive. She had not gone to the door. Not then. She was not ready then. She needed to understand what she was walking into before she walked into it. And to do that, she needed to be inside, and to be inside, she needed a reason. A reason that would not announce her as the daughter of the previous owner, because she was quite certain that the moment she announced that, she would be sent away, and everything. The papers, the record, the correspondence she needed to find in her father's study would be locked behind doors she could not open. So she had applied, through the village post office, for the position of housemaid. The housekeeper had written back within a week. They were understaffed. Could she present herself on Monday morning? She presented herself on Monday morning. The housekeeper, a compact woman of 50 or so, named Mrs. Fenwick, had looked her over with the kind of efficient eye that took stock of a person in under 10 seconds and delivered its verdict without sentiment. "You've done service before?" "Yes, ma'am," Isobel said. She had, in fact, spent 3 days at the village vicarage 2 years ago, helping the vicar's wife prepare for a parish dinner, which she decided was close enough to count. References? She handed over the letter she had written herself, on plain paper, in handwriting she had disguised. It named a household in Derbyshire. She had chosen Derbyshire deliberately, far enough away that no one would ride up to verify it. Mrs. Fenwick read it, folded it, and tucked it into her apron pocket. Wages are £12 per annum. Half day off on Sundays. You'll start in the East Corridor and work your way through the house as directed. Is that understood? Yes, ma'am. Good. Put your things in the 3rd room on the left, top of the servants' stair. Breakfast is at 6. Isobel put her things in the room. It was small and cold, with a narrow window that looked out over the kitchen garden. She stood at it for a moment and looked at the beds of herbs, rosemary and thyme and a struggling lavender, that her mother had planted 20 years ago. Her chest did something she did not let herself examine too closely. Then she went back downstairs and started on the East Corridor. She was on her knees with a brush and a bucket, working at a particularly stubborn patch of mud near the wainscoting, when she heard the footsteps on the marble and looked up. The Duke of Ashmore was not quite what she had expected. She had constructed an image of him over the past weeks, a man of middle age, stout perhaps, with the satisfied look of someone who had acquired something cheaply and was pleased about it. What she saw instead was a man perhaps 32 or 33, dark-haired, with the kind of angular face that suggested he had spent considerable time outdoors. He was dressed plainly, though the quality of the coat was obvious even to a cursory inspection. He was reading a letter and did not look at her immediately. Then he stopped. "These are mine," he said, and pointed to a pair of boots sitting beside the hall stand, muddy from the morning ride, caked at the heel, the kind of boots that would require a good quarter-hour with a stiff brush. He did not say it unkindly. He said it the way a man states a fact. "See that they're done before noon." "Yes, Your Grace," Isobel said. He glanced down at her, a brief glance, the kind that took in her cap and her apron and her bucket and moved on without interest, and then continued down the corridor. She stared at the boots for a moment. Then she picked them up and carried them to the scullery. She had cleaned a great many things in Thornfield Park over the years. She had never cleaned anyone's boots before. She discovered it was deeply unpleasant work, and that whoever had ridden out that morning had gone through ground that was significantly wetter than it looked from the road. She worked in silence, listening to the sounds of the house around her. The cook calling instructions from the kitchen, the rattle of a coal scuttle somewhere on the upper floor, the muffled exchange of voices that she had already begun to map and categorize. She had established 7 other servants currently in residence. Mrs. Fenwick, who ran the household with brisk and absolute authority. Thomas, the footman, who was 19 and visibly uncertain about almost everything. A cook named Agnes who spoke only when spoken to and whose food was, Isobel had to acknowledge, excellent. 3 maids, a groom, and Mrs. Drummond. Mrs. Drummond was not a servant. This was something that became apparent within the first hour, and continued to become more apparent with each passing day. She had arrived at Thornfield 2 weeks before Isobel, with a maid of her own and 3 large trunks, and she occupied the best guest room in the south wing, the room that had been, once, Isobel's grandmother's room, and she treated the household staff with the particular practiced condescension of someone who had learned, very early, that the way one treats servants is largely invisible to the people who matter. She was, apparently, being considered as a future duchess. Her mother, a formidable woman named Lady Winthorpe, whom Isobel had not yet seen in person, but whose correspondence with the Duke's secretary was apparently extensive, had been conducting a campaign to this end for some months. Lady Winthorpe had selected her daughter for the Duke the way one selects a property, based on its assets, its situation, and its potential for appreciation. Mrs. Drummond herself was 24 and beautiful in a cool, symmetrical way that Isobel found herself reluctantly acknowledging. She was also, Isobel observed over the course of several days, the kind of person who reserved her warmth entirely for people who could do something for her. With the Duke, she was gracious and attentive. With Mrs. Fenwick, she was distantly correct. With the maids, she was something else entirely. Not loud, never theatrical, but precise in the way she reduced people, a word here and a look there, with the ease of someone who has never been made to account for it. Isobel disliked her immediately. She was careful not to let this show. On the 4th day, Isobel was carrying a stack of fresh linens up the main staircase. She had been temporarily reassigned from the east corridor to assist with airing the bedrooms. When she passed the open door of her father's study, she stopped. It was the same room, the same dark paneling, the same broad desk at the south window, the same view over the ha-ha and the field beyond it where her father had kept the Hereford cattle. The furniture was rearranged slightly. The reading chair had been moved closer to the fireplace, and there was a large writing table now that her father had not had. But otherwise, it was the same. There was a painting on the wall that she did not recognize, a landscape in gray and blue that someone had hung where her father's collection of field maps had been. She stood in the doorway for longer than she should have. "Miss," she turned. The Duke was behind her in the corridor. He was looking at her with an expression she could not immediately classify. Not irritated, not concerned, attentive perhaps. "I beg your pardon, Your Grace," she said, and looked at the floor, and moved to continue down the corridor. "Were you looking for something?" "No, Your Grace. I lost my direction for a moment." A pause. "The linens for the south rooms are in that direction," he said. He nodded ahead of her, not past her. "Thank you, Your Grace." She continued down the corridor without looking back. Her hands, she noticed, were very steady. She was rather proud of this. On the 6th day she found the papers, not the ones she was looking for, not the estate documents, not the correspondence with the solicitor, but a set of letters in the 3rd drawer of the secretary, in the morning room which she was dusting under the careful supervision of absolutely no one. She recognized her father's handwriting on the 2nd envelope. Her heart did something complicated in her chest, and she put the envelope in her apron pocket with the casualness of a woman who has not just stolen something and finished dusting the secretary and went on with her morning. She read the letter that night by the light of her candle. It was dated 4 months before her father's death. It was addressed to Reginald Crane, and it was even reading it now, a year and a half later, with the cold knowledge of everything that had followed, unexpectedly tender. Her father had written, "I am putting this in your hands because I trust you above any man. I know Thornfield must go to Isobel. Whatever the settlements say, whatever the law finds convenient to argue. That was always the intention, and it must remain so. I am asking you to see that it does." Her uncle had not seen that it did. She lay in the narrow bed in the small room with the kitchen garden window and looked at the ceiling and breathed very carefully for a while. In the morning she went back to work. She had been at Thornfield 11 days when Mrs. Drummond found a reason to have her dismissed. It was not technically Isobel's fault. She had been in the dining room early, clearing away the last of the breakfast things, when she heard the voices in the corridor. Mrs. Drummond's and someone else's, a voice she did not recognize, low and carrying. The exchange was brief, and she was not meant to hear it, and what she heard was enough that she remained very still beside the sideboard for longer than she should have, and when she finally moved, the door had swung open, and Mrs. Drummond had come in and had found her there, and had looked at her the way you look at something you have decided is inconvenient. "What are you doing in here?" she said. "Clearing, ma'am. You've been in here for some time. I noticed you specifically when I walked past 10 minutes ago." This was probably true. Isobel kept her eyes down. "I apologize, ma'am. I was being thorough." "Were you?" Mrs. Drummond's voice was pleasant in the way that things can be pleasant before they are not. "You were listening." "No, ma'am. I think you were." She moved to the bell and rang it. When the footman appeared, she said simply, "Please tell Mrs. Fenwick that this girl is to be let go today." Mrs. Fenwick had the grace to look apologetic. "She's made no complaints against you," she said quietly, as Isobel folded her apron in the housekeeper's room. "If it were my decision alone, I understand," Isobel said. "You'll want your reference." "That won't be necessary," Isobel said. "Thank you, Mrs. Fenwick. You've been very kind." She took her things and she walked out through that kitchen garden, past the rosemary and the struggling lavender, and she stood at the south gate and looked back at the house for a moment. The afternoon light was coming through the lime trees at an angle she recognized. Her mother had painted that angle once, a watercolor that was still somewhere in the house, presumably in some cupboard or storeroom leaning against a wall. She had not found what she needed. She had found something. She had found the letter. She walked back to the village inn and asked the girl at the desk if she could have the same room she'd had the week before, and the girl said yes. The solicitor, when she finally reached him in London 2 days later, arriving on his doorstep in person because he would not answer her letters, was surprised to see her, and then, when he understood the situation, she set the letter more surprised. She set the letter on his desk. She sat across from him and waited while he read it. She did not say anything. He set it down. He looked at it. He said, "Miss Crane, Mr. Alderton," she said. "The situation is more complex than." "The situation," she said, "is that my father instructed his brother in writing to protect my inheritance, that his brother failed to do so, and that the estate is currently occupied by a man who appears to have purchased it under circumstances that I have not yet been able to fully document, but intend to." She paused. "I would like to know what His Grace paid for it, and under what arrangement, and whether anyone in this office was consulted before the transaction was completed." Mr. Alderton opened his mouth and closed it. The conversation that followed lasted 2 hours and covered territory that Isobel had not anticipated and some that she had. By the time she emerged onto the street, the late afternoon had gone gray and cool, and she stood on the pavement outside the solicitor's office and allowed herself, for the first time in 11 days, to feel everything she had been carefully not feeling. She did not cry. She was not. She had decided at some point in the past 18 months, a person who cried in public, but she stood very still for a while, and then she straightened and hailed a cab and went back to her hotel. It was the Duke who came to the inn. She was not expecting that. She had been expecting, perhaps, another letter from the solicitor, or a message from someone's secretary, or more silence. She was not expecting a knock at her door on Thursday afternoon, and when she opened it, she was certainly not expecting to find the Duke of Ashmore standing in the corridor of a village inn, without his secretary, without his footman, looking as though he had ridden hard to get there. He looked at her for a moment. She looked at him. "You're Crane's daughter," he said. "Yes, Your Grace." He absorbed this. "You were working in the East Corridor," he said. It was not quite a question. "Yes, Your Grace." He was quiet for a moment. She could see him working through it. The boots, she supposed, and the morning room and the corridor outside the study. She wondered what conclusions he was drawing and whether they were accurate ones. "Will you sit down with me?" he said, "and tell me what you know?" It was not entirely a question either, but it was, she thought, a more reasonable thing to say than she might have expected. She considered. Then she stepped back from the doorway and let him in, and they sat in the 2 chairs by the window that looked out over the inn yard, and she told him what she knew. She told him about the letter. She told him about the solicitor and the settlement and the 18 months of silence. She told him about her uncle and what her father had written. She told him because she had decided on the walk back from Mr. Alderton's office that she was done being careful about standing at the south gate in the rain and watching the carriages arrive. He listened to all of it without interrupting her. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I paid £8,000 for a property that your uncle's creditors told me was unencumbered." She said, "It wasn't." "No," he said. "I can see that it wasn't." He looked at his hands, then out the window. "Alderton wrote to me last year, when the trusteeship was first established. I was a friend of your uncle's, a distant one, and he mentioned the estate. I was looking for a property in this county." He paused. "I did not know there was a daughter. The solicitor did not mention me." He looked at her. "No." She thought about this. "I see," she said. "I would like to speak to Alderton myself," the Duke said. "And I would like to see your father's letter." He glanced at her. "The one you mentioned to him." She went to her trunk. She had moved it from the coaching inn before going to London and retrieved the letter and gave it to him. He read it carefully. He read it twice. "Your father was a careful man," he said. "Yes," she said. "He was." He folded the letter and held it out to her. She took it. Outside, someone in the inn yard was arguing with a coachman about the price of a feed of oats, and their voices came up through the glass, muffled and ordinary and distant. "There is a portrait," she said, before she had entirely decided to say it, "in the east corridor. A woman in a green dress, standing near a window. That was my mother." He looked at her. "I noticed it," he said after a moment. "I know the one next to it is gone, the field maps. My father had them framed. There were 12 of them, Survey Commission originals going back to the enclosure." She stopped. "I don't know where they are." "The attic, I would think," he said. "I haven't touched anything in the attic." She nodded. She was not sure what she was doing, mentioning the maps. She supposed she was telling him something. That this was not an abstraction, that it was not a legal category, that she knew where the field maps were because she had spent her childhood in this house, and there was not a room or a corridor or a garden bed in it that did not carry something she recognized. She thought he understood this. She was not certain. The meeting with the solicitor, 2 weeks later, was not pleasant for Mr. Alderton. This was, in Isabel's view, appropriate. He had written to her 3 times in the months following her uncle's death and received no response. She had since discovered that the letters had been addressed to an inn in the wrong county. A detail that she took to the meeting with her, written down, dated, itemized, alongside the letter her father had written, and a document that Mr. Alderton's own junior clerk had produced, under the Duke's firm questioning, detailing the date and terms of the transaction and the documents that had, and had not, been presented in support of it. The Duke sat beside her at the table. He did not speak unless it was useful to speak. When it was useful to speak, he spoke with the kind of precision that suggested he had done this before, that he had sat across from people who had something to answer for and had known how to make them answer for it. She found she was grateful for this. She had expected, going into that meeting, to be grateful for his title and his presence, both of which carried weight she did not yet have. She was grateful for those things. But she was more grateful for the way he listened, and the way he set a document on the table, and the way he said, "I'd like you to explain this particular correspondence, Mr. Alderton," and left silence in the room for Alderton to fill. It took another month. There were additional letters, additional meetings, a formal proceeding before the estate court that she was told was routine, and that did not feel routine. The Duke's own solicitor was involved by then, and the matter was recorded and witnessed and settled in language that she did not fully understand, but that Mr. Alderton explained to her afterward with the careful deference of a man who understands that he has been on the wrong side of something. Thornfield Park was hers. It had always been hers. The paperwork now said so. She stood in the entrance hall on the morning that the Duke's remaining things were packed. He had moved to a house he kept in the neighboring county 3 weeks earlier. Once the legal outcome had become sufficiently clear, and looked at the corridor and the staircase and the morning light coming through the fanlight above the door. It fell, as it always had, in a long stripe across the black and white marble floor. She had known that stripe her whole life. She had jumped over it at 6 and 7 and 8, convinced for some reason that stepping on it was unlucky. Mrs. Fenwick appeared at the end of the corridor. She had, with the slightly precarious delicacy of someone navigating a change of employer, expressed her intention to remain in her post if the new household would have her. Isobel had said that of course it would. "There's a gentleman at the door, Miss Crane." She had been Miss Crane here for 3 weeks now, which was still strange, after being no one for 11 days and then nobody in particular for the month that followed. She went to the door. The Duke of Ashmore was standing on the front steps without his secretary, without his footman, in the plain coat, and with the angular, outdoors face she had first seen in the east corridor. He was holding his hat. "I came to see how the house was settling," he said. She considered him. "I think the house is settling well," she said. "Would you like to come in?" He came in. She showed him what she had done with the drawing room. The field maps, all 12 of them, retrieved from the attic and rehung in their original arrangement on the study wall. He looked at them with the attention of a man who is genuinely looking, and then asked about the survey commission. And she told him what her father had told her, which was more than she usually told anyone. And he listened in the way he had listened across from Mr. Alderton, with the same quality of attention, the same steadiness. They walked through the garden in the late afternoon, past the rosemary and the thyme and the lavender, which was doing better now that someone had cleared around it. He asked about the farms, and she told him about the wool trade and the Hereford cattle and the drainage issues on the north field that her father had been meaning to address for years. He offered, once, a thought about drainage, and she considered it seriously and said she thought he might be right. The light through the lime trees came at the angle her mother had painted. She did not think about all the things that might or might not come next. There would be time for those. There was the house, and the garden, and the field maps on the study wall, and the man beside her who had listened when it mattered and asked the right questions and set a document on a table at the right moment. There was time.